bill to the House.
The Honourable Steve Whan.
Deputy President, the opposition will support this bill as we did in the other place. The opposition has said consistently that we awaited, as the government does, the ICAC Commissioner's recommendations when it comes to licences tainted by the corruption findings that we've seen recently from the Independent Commission Against Corruption. In saying that, we have made it clear that should the Commissioner recommend action on those licences, that Labor would obviously agree with that. And this legislation gives the government the capacity to implement that. We accept the argument that it needs to happen now because of the recess. It is always difficult when you get legislation introduced or you get notified of legislation on the morning that it is determined that it should be passed through Parliament, and that does raise some questions about how well thought through the legislation and its implications are, and I'll just highlight a couple of concerns in that regard. But I do, before I do that, note the Minister's comment in his second reading speech that the intention is early next year to fine-tune the legislation to ensure that it doesn't, I assume, overstep the intention outlined. The Minister in his second reading speech, and I understand the Premier in his second reading speech, said that it is the intention of government to only use this special power when ICAC has found serious corruption, and that is an absolutely key point because the bill itself is drafted in quite a wide way. It puts in this public interest test into any right, any petroleum or mining right. Now that includes an exploration licence, an assessment lease, a mining lease, a mineral claim or an opal prospecting licence, and of course also the equivalent carrying over into the Petroleum Act as well. So that's every aspect of the leases available in mining. Now, when we do these things, we obviously need to be cautious about broad definitions, and at this stage in the bill it is simply listed as public interest, and it's obviously up to the Minister and the government to define when the termination of a licence is in the public interest. So it is very important that the commitment in the second reading speech, that it's the intention only to use that upon findings of ICAC, is very clear, because it needs to be absolutely clear to the industry particularly that this is not a broad avenue for opponents of mining to come in and say that it's in the public interest to stop mining titles or to cease exploration titles because of their definition of what the public interest is. And I have to say I would be more comfortable with this if that was detailed more in the legislation. And I hope that's something the government might look at in their fine-tuning next year. But for this stage, I just want to put on note that that is a concern that I have in the current drafting of the bill, but I recognise that it has been drafted quickly. I'd also just note that I would hope that the government has obtained some advice on whether or not or how susceptible it might be to claims for compensation from investors in any companies affected by a decision. I would have thought it's highly likely that investors who may be able to, for instance, show that they have not had any knowledge of corrupt conduct or involvement in corrupt conduct might test this in court under just terms, under the constitutional provisions for just terms compensation. So I do hope that the government has thought that aspect of it through carefully. I do thank the Minister's office for the quick briefing this morning on the legislation, and obviously support the intent of the legislation. It is critical that any recommendations from ICAC on the particular licences that we have seen being the subject of inquiries recently, which the opposition shares the disgust at what we've seen come out in those processes, that the rest of the community holds. It is critical that we are able to act to enforce any recommendations of the ICAC Commissioner. However, there is, I would expect, quite a genuine issue there for people who've invested in new coal without knowledge of what has gone on before in that area, and who may now be potentially suffering the loss of their investment without necessarily being guilty of any crime or ICAC finding in their own right. So I do hope that the government has carefully thought through that issue of compensation, and that the taxpayers won't be having to pay a price on that. But as I said, I hope that when the fine-tuning comes about, we will see something that locks this more tightly to actual findings of either ICAC or a court, and that this doesn't become just a way for community opponents of projects to seek to have licences withdrawn. But with those comments, I do offer the opposition's support for this measure, and that is consistent with all the comments that we've made as this process has gone on through ICAC.